My name is Reagan Hale. I am 34 years old. And on a rainy Tuesday night in Portland, lying on a gurney in an emergency room with a broken arm and a 6-week-old baby in a hospital bassinet beside me, I called my mother for help, and she told me to call an Uber because my sister's cruise was already paid for. I want to tell you exactly how that happened, and exactly what it cost, the people who said it. Because I have spent 12 years as a structural engineer, I am a project manager at a firm that builds bridges and parking structures and the kind of long-span buildings that have to hold thousands of tons without anyone ever thinking about it, and my entire professional life is the study of load, of how much weight a thing can carry before it fails, of where the stress concentrates and which member gives way first. And it took a car accident, a broken arm, and a single sentence from my mother on a Tuesday night to make me finally run that analysis on my own family. And to discover that I had been the one load-bearing member holding up a structure that had been quietly transferring all of its weight onto me for 9 years, while everyone living safely inside it told each other I was simply strong enough to take it. Welcome to Quiet Reckoning, the channel where the people who were called the strong one, the dependable one, the one who could always handle it, finally set the folder down on the table and let the arithmetic speak. If you have ever been the family member who carries the weight while everyone else enjoys the shelter, the one whose strength was treated not as a gift you gave but as a structural fact they were entitled to build on, then stay with me tonight, because I'm going to show you the exact moment the load-bearing member said no. And what happened to the building when it did. The accident was not my fault, which matters less than you would think, and more than I expected. I was driving home from my first solo grocery run since Theo was born, my 6-week-old son, asleep in his car seat in the back, when a man who had been drinking ran a red light on a wet road and put his truck into the driver's side of my small sedan at 30 miles an hour. The car spun. I remember the sound more than the impact, the specific tearing shriek of metal that I had only ever heard in the controlled failure tests of my profession and never once expected to hear from the inside. And then it was over, and the car was sideways against a curb, and I was screaming Theo's name before I even understood that my own left arm was bent the wrong way below the elbow, and a stranger was at my window. And then there were sirens, and the single mercy of the entire night. The one thing I will be grateful for until I die is that my son was in a properly installed rear-facing car seat, and he did not have a scratch on him. Not one. He slept through most of it. I did not. They cut me out of the seatbelt, and they immobilized my arm, and they took us both to the emergency room at St. Belt. Vincent and a kind, exhausted nurse settled Theo into a bassinet beside my gurney while a doctor confirmed what I already knew, that my left radius and ulna were both fractured, that I would need a closed reduction and a cast, and very likely a follow-up with an orthopedic surgeon, and that I should not, under any circumstances, to be lifting or carrying an infant with that arm for the next several weeks. Several weeks. I lay there and did the math, the way I cannot help doing. The load calculation of a single mother with one functioning arm and a 6-week-old who needed to be lifted, carried, filled, and soothed around the clock. And I understood, with the cold clarity I bring to a failing structure, that I could not do the next month alone. I needed help. I needed someone. And so, at 11:15 at night, with my good right hand, I picked up my phone and I called my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, and there was noise behind her. Music. The clink of glasses. The open ambient roar of a restaurant or a bar. And I said, my voice shaking, "Mom, I've been in a car accident. I'm in the ER at St. Vincent. My arm is broken in 2 places. Theo's okay. Thank God he's okay. But I can't lift him. I can't drive. I can't even get us home. Please. Can you come? Or can Dad come? I just need someone to help me get home and stay with me for a few days. And there was a pause. And in the pause, I could hear my mother cover the phone partway and say something to someone near her. And then she came back on the line. And Cheryl Hale, my mother, 62 years old, said to me, over the sound of a celebration I could hear but not see, "Reagan, honey, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. But the timing could not be worse. We are out at your sister's send-off dinner right now. The whole group. Vanessa and Dad and the Prestons. Her cruise sails in the morning, and this dinner has been on the calendar for weeks. We really can't just get up and leave. And honestly, sweetheart, it's a broken arm. Not a heart attack. You're at a hospital. They'll set it. And then you just call an Uber to get home. That's what they're for. Your sister's cruise is already paid for, and we are not going to ruin her last night before she goes. Call an Uber. Text me tomorrow and let me know how you're doing. Call an Uber. Your sister's cruise is already paid for." Those were the words. I lay on that gurney with my arm in a temporary splint and my 6-week-old son sleeping in a plastic bassinet 6 inches from my face. And I listened to my mother choose my sister's send-off dinner over her injured daughter and her infant grandson. And I listened to her frame an Uber as the obvious solution to a woman who had just been told she could not lift her own child. And I want to tell you that I argued, that I begged, that I made her understand, but I did not. Because something happened in me in that exact moment that I have come to think of as the failure point. The load at which a member stops bending and simply, cleanly, breaks. I said, "Okay, Mom." That is all I said. Okay. And I hung up. And I did not cry. I know how that sounds. A woman that freshly hurt and that completely abandoned. Dry-eyed on a hospital gurney, but I need you to understand it. Because it is the hinge of this entire story. I had cried in the car, screaming my son's name. I did not cry when my mother hung up. Something colder and clearer and far quieter took its place. The exact mental state I drop into when I stand in front of a structure that is failing and begin, methodically, to find out why. Because here is what my mother did not know she had just done. She had said the words, "Your sister's cruise is already paid for," to the one person on earth who knew exactly how it had been paid for. Because I had paid for it. Not directly, not knowingly, until that very moment. But as my mother said those words, the whole structure of the last 9 years rotated in my mind and locked into a shape I had been refusing to see. And the shape was this. For 9 years, let me give you the number. Because I am an engineer, and the number is the entire load diagram of this story for 9 years. I had been sending my parents $4,500 a month, $4,500 every month, on the first tenancy by automatic transfer, for 9 years, which is 108 payments, which comes to $486,000. $486,000. And I had been sending it because of a conversation that happened 9 years before. A conversation I had not let myself re-examine even once until I lay on that gurney listening to a restaurant celebrate my sister. 9 years ago. Just after I passed my professional engineering exam and got my first real raise, my parents had asked me to dinner. And over that dinner my mother had cried and my father had stared at his plate. And they had told me they were in serious financial trouble. They told me my father's company had restructured his pension into almost nothing, that there were medical bills from a scare my father had had that insurance had not covered, that the mortgage on the house I grew up in had ballooned and they were at real risk of losing it, and that if I, their successful daughter, their strong one, the one who had always been so capable and so independent, could help just for a while, just until they recovered, they could keep their home and their dignity. And I was 25. And I loved them. And I had just gotten a raise. And I said yes, the way the strong one always says yes. I set up the transfer, $4,500 a month, to keep my parents in their house. And for 9 years it left my account on the first and I never questioned it. Never asked for a mortgage statement or a medical bill or a single piece of proof. Because what kind of daughter audits her own parents' suffering? What kind of monster makes her crying mother itemize her ruin? And here is the part I am ashamed of. The part I have had to make my peace with. Because the warning signs were there for 9 years, and I trained myself not to read them. My sister Vanessa never sent $1. That was understood. In my family, the way the temperature of a room is understood without anyone announcing it, Vanessa was the sensitive one. The artistic one. The one who was finding herself. Who had never held a job longer than a year and never needed to. And asking her to contribute would have been, in my mother's framing, cruel. Because Vanessa simply was not built for that kind of pressure. I was built for it. That was my role. Assigned to me before I was old enough to refuse it. Reagan is strong. Reagan can handle it. Reagan lands on her feet. And so every weight that needed carrying in our family was quietly set on Reagan's back. And every soft thing that could be given was given to Vanessa. And I told myself for 34 years that this was just the shape of us. Just personalities. Just how it was. And not what it actually was. Which was a decision my parents had made about which of their 2 daughters existed to give and which existed to receive. So I paid, through buying my own modest townhouse. Through an entire pregnancy, I went through alone after Theo's father decided fatherhood was not for him. Through all of it, I paid $486,000 to keep my family from falling. Because I was the strong one. And the strong one does not let the building come down. If you have ever sent money to family for years on a story you never once verified, type the word strong in the comments right now. Because I need to know how many of us are out here. How many people have been the load-bearing wall in a house full of people who never once thought to thank the wall and then stay with me? Because what I figured out on that gurney, with my arm in a splint and my son asleep beside me, is the reason this channel exists. Because while I lay there, my phone still in my hand, I did something I had not done in 9 years. I opened my banking app, and I looked. And the first thing I saw, because the universe has a vicious sense of timing, was that my sister Vanessa had tagged me 20 minutes earlier in a photo on her public profile. A photo clearly taken at the very dinner my mother was calling from. Vanessa, 37, my older sister, in a restaurant, raising a glass of champagne, surrounded by my parents and her friends, the Prestons. And the caption read, "Last dinner before I sail away 10 days in the Caribbean. Balcony suite. I am so blessed. Thank you to the best parents in the world for the send-off. Some of us just attract good things into our lives. 10 days in the Caribbean. Balcony suite. Thank you to the best parents in the world. Some of us just attract good things." And I lay on that gurney with my broken arm and my sleeping son, and I looked at that photo. My mother somewhere in the background of it, raising her own glass. 20 minutes before she told her injured daughter to call an Uber, and the engineer in me. The part that has spent 12 years calculating exactly where a load actually travels versus where people assume it goes. Did the analysis in one cold, clean instant. A family genuinely about to lose its house does not send the favored daughter on a balcony suite cruise through the Caribbean. The money was not holding up a mortgage. The story did not match the photograph. And when a structural engineer finds that the load path does not match the drawing, she stops trusting the drawing. And she opens the structure up to find out where the weight is really going. So I did the thing I should have done 9 years before. With my one good hand, lying on that gurney, I opened the recurring transfer $4,500. Scheduled. as it had been 108 times. For the first of the month, 9 days away, and the app asked me, in its calm gray font, "Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer?" The single question my entire family had built their comfort on, the certainty I would never ask. And I looked at it for a long moment. And then with my thumb I pressed yes. 9 years and $486,000. Ended on a gurney in an emergency room. With one hand, in the time it takes to tap a screen. And then I did the second thing. The thing that actually mattered. Because canceling the transfer was about the past, and this was about the next month of my son's life. I opened a browser, and I found a licensed in-home caregiving service that the hospital social worker had on a printed list taped to the wall, and right there from the gurney, by phone and by text. I arranged for a postpartum and recovery caregiver, a woman named Marisol Vega, a nurse with years of experience helping injured new mothers, to meet me at my townhouse the next morning and to stay with me as long as my arm needed. Lifting and carrying my son when I could not, at a cost that did not make me flinch at all, because I had just freed up $4,500 a month, and I knew exactly where that money was going from now on. It was going to the only person in this entire story who had never asked me for anything. It was going to Theo. And lying there, having stopped the bleeding and arranged the help, all with one hand, I felt for the first time in 9 years a strange, unfamiliar lightness, the specific weightlessness of a load-bearing wall that has finally, quietly, set down a weight it was never supposed to carry. I had spent my whole career writing reports about what happens to a structure when one member is asked to carry more than it was designed for. First it deflects. Slowly. So slowly, no one notices. And then it cracks somewhere out of sight. And then, on an ordinary day under an ordinary load, it fails all at once, and everyone says they never saw it coming. I had been deflecting for 9 years. I had cracked. Quietly. Somewhere, no one was looking. A long time ago. And on a gurney at midnight, with my mother's words still in my ear, I had finally, cleanly, failed in the only direction that would save me. I had stopped carrying them. I thought that was the end of the night. I thought I would call my Uber, exactly as my mother had instructed, and go home with my son and my broken arm and my newly emptied transfer, and that the reckoning, whatever it would be, would come later. I was wrong, because at 20 minutes to 1 in the morning, while I was still working out how I would even get Theo's car seat into a stranger's car with one arm, the automatic double doors of the emergency room slid open with their soft pneumatic sigh, and a man walked in out of the rain. An old man in a soaked canvas jacket with water running off the brim of his cap. 80 years old. Who had driven across the city in the middle of the night the moment a hospital had called the secondary contact on my file because I could not reach anyone else, and it was not my mother. And it was not my father. And it was not my sister. It was my grandfather, Walter Hale. My father's father. 80 years old. A man who had spent 30 years as an accountant for the United States Army before he retired. A man who balanced ledgers for a living on 3 continents and who said little and missed nothing. And who had, I would learn before that night was over, I'd been quietly watching the books of this family for far longer than any of us understood. I had listed him as my secondary emergency contact years ago, almost as an afterthought. After a falling out I will tell you about. Because in the back of my mind even then there had been one person I trusted to come. And it was not the 2 people who had made me. It was the old man who had taught me to read a balance sheet at his kitchen table when I was 12. The hospital had worked down the list when I could reach no one. And they had reached him. And he had been in his truck before they finished the sentence. And he did not come to me empty-handed. He had stopped at the nursing station, and he had shown them something. And they had brought him to the bassinet first. And when he came around the curtain into the bay where I lay, he was carrying my 6-week-old son against his chest in the careful two-handed grip of a man who had not held a baby in 40 years but had not forgotten how, and tucked under his arm, against his side, where the rain had not reached it, was a worn brown leather folder. To the kind of folder a careful man keeps important things in. The kind of folder that does not get carried into an emergency room at 1 a.m. by accident. And he stood at the foot of my gurney, with my son in his arms and that folder under his elbow. And he looked at me lying there with my broken arm and my phone still in my hand. And his old eyes went over all of it, the splint, the bassinet, the empty chairs, the absence of every person who should have been standing where he now stood, and he understood the whole of it in a single look, the way he had always understood everything. And my grandfather said, "They're not coming, are they?" It was not a question. He said it the way you read a final figure off the bottom of a column, flat and certain and already knowing the answer. And I did not have to say anything, because the empty chairs and the splint and the look on my face had already told him everything. And Walter Hale, 80 years old, soaked to the shoulders, simply nodded once, slowly, as if a thing he had suspected for a very long time had finally, formally, been confirmed. And then he did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He did not sit down and demand the story. He did not ask me what had happened or who had said what. He crossed to the side of my gurney, and he leaned down, still holding my sleeping son in the crook of one arm, and with his free hand he smoothed the hair back off my forehead the way a parent does to a child with a fever. And he said, very quietly, "You did the hard part already. I can see it on you. You've got the look your grandmother used to get when she'd finally decided something. So we're going to get you and this boy home. And Walter's going to stay. And then, when you've slept, I am going to show you what is in this folder. Because I have been carrying it for a long time, waiting for the night you'd be ready to see it. And I think, Reagan, that the night just picked itself. And that is what we did." He arranged everything with the same quiet competence he had brought to everything my entire life. He spoke to the discharge nurse. He had them show him how to manage the car seat. He carried Theo out to his old truck, in the rain under his own coat. He drove us home through empty, wet streets at 2 a.m. And he carried my son up the stairs to my townhouse and laid him in his bassinet. And then he made up the couch for himself without being asked, and told me to sleep. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone else was holding the weight. And I slept. He stayed that night. And the next. And the one after. Until Marisol, the caregiver, had settled in, and my arm had been properly cast, and I could manage the rhythm of one-handed motherhood. And in those days my grandfather was simply present, in the unobtrusive way of a man who had spent his life being useful without being loud. He washed dishes. He held the baby. He fixed the latch on my back gate that I had been meaning to fix for a year. And I need to tell you about the falling out, because it matters to what comes next. 3 years earlier, at a family gathering, my grandfather had said something quiet to my mother about Vanessa's spending. Some small, mild observation about how a grown woman might be encouraged to stand on her own feet. And my mother had not liked it. And within a month, a story had gone around the family that Walter was getting old, getting difficult, getting confused, that he said cruel things now and could not really be trusted to understand the family's affairs. And slowly, deliberately, my parents had eased him out fewer invitations, shorter visits, a gentle campaign to make the sharpest mind in the family look like a fading one. And I, to my shame, had half believed it, because it was easier to believe than the alternative. And I had let the distance grow between my grandfather and me for 3 years on the strength of a slander my mother manufactured precisely because Walter was the one person in the family whose eyes she could not fool. The reason I had listed him as my emergency contact anyway, despite 3 years of distance, was that some part of me had never actually believed the story. Some part of me had remembered the man who taught me to read a balance sheet at 12 and known, underneath the manufactured doubt, that if I were ever truly in trouble, he was the one human being who would come. And he had come, through the rain, at 80. The moment they called, the family had spent 3 years telling me he could not be trusted to understand the books, and he walked into that ER having understood the books better than any of us the entire time. And on the third evening, when Marisol had gone home and Theo was asleep and the rain had finally stopped, my grandfather sat down across from me at my kitchen table, and he set the worn brown leather folder on the table between us. And he put his 2 old hands flat on top of it, and he said, "All right, before I open this, I want to tell you how it came to exist. Because the how is half of what you need to understand. You know I was an accountant for the Army for 30 years. What you maybe don't know is what that does to a man's eye. I spent 3 decades finding the place where the money on the page and the money in the world stopped matching. Because that gap, Reagan, that little gap between what the ledger says and what is actually true, that is where every theft that has ever happened lives. And about 6 years ago, at one of your mother's Christmas dinners, I watched your sister Vanessa open the keys to a new car. And I watched your parents pretend it was a surprise to them too. And I listened to your father, in the same hour, tell me how tight things were, how grateful they were that you were helping them stay afloat, and the gap opened up in front of me the way it used to on the page. That little daylight between the story and the truth, and I could not stop seeing it. And then, when I said one careful word about it, they decided I was the problem. And they spent 3 years telling this whole family I'd lost my judgment. Telling you I'd lost my judgment. Because a man who keeps the books is the most dangerous person in the room to people who are cooking them. They didn't push me out because I was confused. Reagan, they pushed me out because I wasn't. So I did the only thing a pushed-out bookkeeper can do. I went quiet. And I kept keeping the books. And I waited. And he opened the folder. Inside, in the meticulous hand of a man who had kept ledgers for the federal government, were 6 years of records, not guesses. Not suspicions. But records. Because here was the thing my grandfather then explained to me. The thing that changed the floor under my feet? That account you've been sending your $4,500 to every month. He said, the family account. The one your mother set up 9 years ago and told you to send the help to. Reagan. Look at me. That account was not opened by your mother. It was opened, originally, by me. 20 years ago. As a joint family account, your grandmother and I used to help your father when he was young and starting out. When your grandmother passed, I left it open, and I left my name on it. Because I am an old man, and closing accounts is a nuisance, and I never imagined it would matter. Your mother knew it existed, and when she decided, 9 years ago, that she wanted a clean channel to collect money from you, she did not open something new that might raise a question. She reactivated the old family account. The one with the trustworthy family history. And she had you send your money there. And she never once stopped to remember, or never once cared, that the account she had chosen still had my name on it as a co-holder. Which means, Reagan, that for 9 years, every statement on that account has been mailed, quarterly, to the address of record. And the address of record, on an account I opened 20 years ago, is my house. I sat very still. They have been mailing me the evidence, my grandfather said. For 9 years. Your mother routed your money through the one account in this family that reports to me. I have a statement for every quarter. I have watched 486,000 of your dollars come in. and I have watched every dollar of it go back out. And I am now going to show you exactly where it went. And I need you to be ready, because it is worse than you think. And the worst part is not the amount. And he laid the statements out across my kitchen table, quarter by quarter. 9 years of them. And he walked me through the flow of my own money with the calm forensic patience of a man reading a balance sheet aloud. $4,500 arrived from me on the 1st of every month. And within days, every month, it left. There was no mortgage payment. Because, and my grandfather slid a single sheet toward me. A county property record, he had pulled himself the house I grew up in. The house my parents had wept they were about to lose. Had been owned free and clear. With no mortgage at all. For 11 years. 11 years. There had never been a mortgage in danger. There had never been a balloon payment. Never been a bank circling. My father's pension had not been gutted. My grandfather had the man's own bragging emails about his comfortable retirement to prove it. The medical scare had been real, but had been covered in full by insurance, with the records to show a total out-of-pocket cost of under $900. Every single beam of the story they had built to get my money had been. My grandfather showed me line by line, structurally false from the day they poured it. And the money my money had gone. Instead, exactly where the gap in the ledger had always pointed, it went to Vanessa. Her rent. Paid in full. Every month. For 9 years. On an apartment she described to her friends as something she had earned. Her cars. First one and then a nicer one. The leases running in my father's name, but the keys always in her hand. Her credit card balances. Cleared again and again. Thousands of dollars in restaurants and boutiques and salons. Wiped clean each time they climbed too high, and then allowed to climb again. Her wedding. 4 years ago. The lavish wedding I had attended and toasted and helped pay for without knowing it. $60,000 of it, traceable straight back through the family account. To me, I had stood at that wedding in a bridesmaid dress my sister chose, holding my own gift. And I had paid for the flowers, the band, the open bar, and the honeymoon. And not one person at the head table had known to feel ashamed. Because not one person at the head table thought of me as anything but the source. And vacations, a steady, unbroken stream of vacations. Beach resorts and ski weeks and city breaks. The favored daughter who just attracted good things, attracting them, it turned out, directly out of her sister's bank account. Year after year. While I told myself I simply could not afford to travel, and never once asked why a woman with my salary always felt so stretched. I had been stretched because I was carrying 2 households and a secret nest egg, and never knew it. And then my grandfather placed his finger on a charge dated 11 days earlier. And he said the thing I had already known was coming, and still was not ready to hear. And this one, $14,000. A cruise line. 10 days. Caribbean. Balcony suite. Booked 6 weeks ago. Paid from the family account. Funded by your transfer. The trip your mother told you was already paid for. Reagan the trip. She would not leave dinner to help her injured daughter because of you paid for it. You have paid for every trip that girl has ever taken. You were lying on a gurney with a broken arm. Unable to lift your own son. Being told to call an Uber. So that the money you earned could sail your sister around the Caribbean in a balcony suite. That is the gap between the story and the truth. That is where it always lived. And then my grandfather told me the part that was worse than the amount. Exactly as he had warned me. The part that turned the cold in me into something with a much harder edge. There is one more thing in these statements. And it is the thing that made me start carrying this folder in my truck. Waiting. Your parents were not only spending your money on your sister, they were skimming, every month. Before the rest went out to Vanessa. A portion stayed moved into a separate savings account in your mother's name alone. Not a fortune each month. A few hundred. Sometimes 1,000. But every month. For 9 years. Quietly building. They told you they were drowning. Reagan. And they used your money to keep your sister in luxury and to quietly build themselves a cushion on the side. A cushion they have never mentioned to anyone. That sits today. I have the balance at just over $110,000. They were not poor. They were never poor. They cried poverty to a daughter who had just gotten her first raise. And then they used her devotion to fund one child's vanity and their own secret nest egg. And they let that same daughter believe, for 9 years, that her sacrifice was the only thing standing between her parents and the street. That is not a family that fell on hard times and reached for help. That is a family that looked at its most generous member and saw a revenue stream. And do you understand what the skimming tells you? Reagan. That the spending alone does not. Spending your money on your sister. They could at least tell themselves a story about she needed it. She's family. It all stays in the family. But the savings account in your mother's name alone, to the cushion they hid from everyone and grew in the dark for 9 years, that was not for the family. That was for them. Against the day they might need it. A private lifeboat built out of your labor that they fully intended you would never know existed. People who are merely weak take what they need and feel bad about it. People who build a hidden reserve out of someone else's sacrifice have stopped seeing that someone as a person at all. They were not desperate. Reagan. They were comfortable. And they were greedy. And they were saving. If you have ever found out that the hardship you bled to relieve was never real, that the people who cried to you were not drowning but fishing, and you were the catch, then do one thing before you watch the rest of this: subscribe to this channel. Because Quiet Reckoning is built for exactly this moment. The moment the generous one finally sees the real ledger. And I promise you, there are more of us out here than these families ever wanted us to find each other and learn. Because here is what I did. Sitting at that kitchen table with 9 years of my own betrayal spread out in my grandfather's careful hand. I did not pick up the phone and scream at my mother. I want to be clear about that. Because I know that is the version some of you are bracing for. Instead, I turned my own phone around on the table, and I showed my grandfather the screen. And I showed him what I had already done, 11 days before any of these statements. Lying on the gurney. On nothing but the cold instinct that woke in me when I read a caption about paradise. I showed him the canceled transfer, and my grandfather looked at that screen for a long moment. And then he looked up at me, and his old eyes were bright. And he said, "You already shut it off, before I showed you a single page. On your own. With a broken arm. From a hospital bed." And he sat back in his chair, and he let out a long breath. And he said, "Your grandmother would have done exactly the same. And in exactly that order, stopped the bleeding first. And asked for the proof second. The proof is not for you. Reagan. You already know. The proof is for them. The proof is for the day. And it is coming. When they realize the money has stopped and they come to your door with the crying faces, and they try to make you believe you have imagined all of it. That you are being cruel. That you are tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. On that day, you will not need to argue with them. You will not need to raise your voice. You will simply need to know, all the way to the bottom of yourself, that everything they are about to say is a lie, and that you have it. In writing. In your grandfather's hand. Now. And he squared the statements back into a neat stack, and he set his hand on top of them. And his face changed. Became graver and older and more careful. And he said the thing that told me the night at the kitchen table was not over. That the $486,000 and the hidden $110,000 were not even the whole of it. There is one more matter. And it is mine. Not theirs. and it is the reason I have kept my name on that old account all these years, even though it was a nuisance. Because somewhere in me, I always knew it might come to this. I am 80 years old. Reagan. I have more put away than this family has ever once thought to wonder about. Because I learned a long time ago to let people underestimate what a quiet man has. And I have spent the last 2 years, since I first started carrying this folder, making some decisions with a lawyer about where all of it goes when I am gone. Decisions that your father and your sister are absolutely certain they understand. The same way they were certain about everything else. And about which they are about to find out they were never reading the ledger correctly at all. But that, my girl, is a conversation for tomorrow, when you have slept on what you saw tonight. Because once I show you what I have signed, and when, and why, there will be nothing left for any of them to take from you or that boy ever again, and I want you steady when I show you. Because it is going to land on this family like the roof coming down. And he stood. And he kissed the top of my head. And he carried his coffee cup to the sink and washed it and set it in the rack. An 80-year-old army accountant who had just dismantled, with a folder of quarterly statements, the entire story of my life, and I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet with 9 years of the truth in front of me and my son asleep down the hall. And for the first time since the headlights came through my window, I did not feel like something that had been broken. I felt like something that had finally, after carrying a false load for 9 years, I'd been told the real weight it was designed to bear and discovered it was so much lighter than the lie. My grandfather came back the next evening, after Thea was down and the dishes were done. And he was not alone. He brought with him a woman named Miss Sader Delacroix, an attorney he introduced as the lawyer who had handled his affairs for 15 years. And the two of them sat at my kitchen table in the lamplight while I made coffee one-handed, and Walter watched me do it with the patient pride of a man who had decided some time ago that I could manage anything. And when I sat down, he opened the worn brown folder to a section I had not seen the night before. A section behind a tab divider. And he laid out a document with a blue legal backing, and he said, "Last night I showed you what they did. Tonight I'm going to show you what I did about it. 2 years ago. Long before that drunk ran a red light. Because I want you to understand that what is about to happen to this family was already decided. It did not happen because you got hurt. It happened because of who came to the hospital and who did not, and I had simply already guessed. 2 years ago. Who that would be. And Ms. Delacroix, in the calm, even voice of a person who has explained many difficult documents to many stunned people, walked me through it. For my entire life, my father and my sister had operated on a single comfortable assumption that my grandfather Walter, the quiet old army accountant who drove a 15-year-old truck and clipped coupons and never spent a dollar he did not have to, was a man of modest means, and that whatever small thing he left behind when he died would pass, as these things do, to his only son, my father, and through him eventually to the favored grandchild, Vanessa. They had said as much, openly, for years. The same way they said, everything whatever Dad's got put away, it'll sort itself out. It's not much anyway. And here is the thing their contempt had blinded them to. The same contempt that made them unable to see me as anything but a faucet. Because a man who keeps the books for the federal government for 30 years and lives below his means for 60 does not end up with not much. My grandfather, Ms. Delacroix explained, was worth a great deal more than this family had ever once thought to wonder about 3 decades of a disciplined saver's salary. A house bought for almost nothing in a neighborhood that had since become valuable, and a portfolio he had managed himself. Quietly. With the same forensic care he brought to everything. For 40 years. She walked me through the holdings the way Walter had walked me through the betrayal. Line by line. and I sat there and listened to the inventory of a man I had spent 3 years half believing was fading. A brokerage account he had fed a few dollars at a time out of a soldier's salary and never once rated. That 40 years of leaving alone had turned into something that made me set down my coffee. The house in the valuable neighborhood. Paid off for decades. Worth many times what he gave for it. Government bonds. Bought at every posting on every continent and quietly held to maturity. Decade after decade. None of it flashy. None of it anything my mother would have looked at twice. Because my mother, like my whole family, had spent her life unable to tell the difference between a man who is poor and a man who simply refuses to perform his money for an audience, the very same blindness that had made them unable to see anything in me but a reliable monthly balance to draw down. The quiet ones, it turns out, are quiet because they are busy keeping the books. The number Ms. Nadiental, Delacroix said out loud, made me set down my coffee. And 2 years ago, 2 years before the accident, 2 years before any of us knew there would be a night, like the one I had just lived through, my grandfather had gone to Ms. Krause's Delacroix and rewritten his entire estate. Your grandfather's previous will, the lawyer said, left the bulk of his estate to your father, with a portion to be divided among the grandchildren. He revoked it. The will that is now in force, executed 2 years ago and reaffirmed last spring, does the following. And she read it to me. And I want to tell you what it said. Because it is the keystone that holds the whole arch. My grandfather had left everything: the house, the portfolio, the bonds, the accounts, the disciplined fortune of an underestimated man to 2 people, Reagan Hale and Theodore Hale, to me, and to my son, who was 6 weeks old and asleep down the hall and who, before my own mother had bothered to drive across town to meet him, was already the co-heir to everything his great-grandfather had spent 60 years building, held in trust for him with a clause that no future relation could ever pressure, borrow, or talk it away from the boy. My father was named in the will. So was Vanessa. Ms. Delacroix turned to the page and read it. And her voice did not change, but the room did. To my son Douglas and my granddaughter Vanessa, my grandfather had left the sum of $1 each, and a single sealed letter, to be opened privately, in which the will stated he had set down for them, plainly, his reasons, and his hope that they might one day understand the difference between the people who carry a family and the people who merely feed on it. $1 each. And a letter. For the son and the favored granddaughter who had spent 3 years telling everyone the old man had lost his mind. Precisely so, that no one would think to ask what the old man actually knew. I sat with that document in front of me, and I understood, finally and completely, that my grandfather had seen all of it, coming from 2 years away, had watched the way this family treated its generous daughter and its inconvenient old man, had run the numbers the way he ran every number, and had quietly built, with a lawyer and a folder and his name left on an old account, a structure designed to make certain that when the day came, the only 2 people in this family who had never taken anything would be the only 2 people who received everything. He did not do this to punish them. Ms. San, Delacroix said gently, I want you to hear that. Because he was very clear with me. He did it because an estate is the last ledger a man balances. And he was not willing to let his last ledger lie. He was not willing to leave the bulk of what he built to people who would spend it the way they spent yours. On themselves. And call it their due. He chose to leave it to the 2 people who, he said, I would understand that it was never about the money, it was about who shows up in the rain. If you have ever been the one who showed up, the one who carried the weight while the loud ones congratulated each other on their good fortune, and you found out that somewhere in your life there was one quiet person keeping the real books, all along, waiting to set them right, Then do one thing before this story ends. Subscribe. And go find that person while you still can. Because not everyone gets the chance I got. And I almost wasted mine on a slander. Here's how it settled. Because I know you have been the strong one too. And you need to know the book's balance in the end. We did not call them. I want to be clear about that. Because I know some of you are waiting for the scene where I drive to my parents' house and lay the statements on their table and make them look. That is not what happened. And it is not what power looks like. Power, my grandfather taught me, does not raise its voice. Power simply stops signing the checks and waits. So I waited. And on the 1st of the month, for the first time in 9 years, $4,500 did not leave my account. And I want to tell you exactly how long it took the people who had abandoned me in an emergency room to notice the money was gone. It took 2 days. On the 3rd, my mother called. I did not answer. She called again. And then the texts began. And I saved every one of them. Because my grandfather had taught me that the person who keeps the record is the person who is never at the mercy of someone else's version of events. The first text was breezy. Certain it was a glitch, honey. The transfer didn't come through this month. You'll want to check with your bank. The second, days later, was tighter. Reagan. It's still not here. This isn't like you. We have things that depend on that. Please sort it out. The third, a week in. Drop the pretense entirely. Reagan, your sister can't pay her rent, and you have completely stopped communicating. What is wrong with you? After everything we have done for you, how can you abandon your family like this? After everything we have done for you, there it was. The whole architecture of 9 years in a single sentence, not are you healing? Not how is the baby? Not we are so sorry we left you in the ER. But your sister can't pay her rent, and how can you abandon your family? The injured one was the abandoner. The robbed one was the villain. My grandfather had told me, word for word, that this was exactly what they would say. And reading it arrive on my screen precisely as he had predicted was the moment I stopped. Finally and forever. Needing them to understand. And then, on a Saturday, they did the thing my grandfather said they would do. My parents drove to my townhouse. Both of them. And my sister Vanessa came too. Tanned from 10 days in the Caribbean. And the 3 of them stood on my porch and knocked. And when I opened the door with Theo on my good hip and my cast arm cradled against my chest, my mother started immediately, the tears already working. Reagan, this has gone far enough. We are your family. You cannot just cut us off over a misunderstanding. Your sister is about to be evicted, and I looked at the 3 of them on my porch, and I felt my grandfather's presence in the house behind me, where he was sitting with his coffee pretending not to listen. And I discovered that everything he had given me held. I did not produce the statements. I did not say the words cruise or skimming or $110,000. I did not give them the fight they had driven across the city to have. I simply said, in a voice that did not shake, you told me to call an Uber. I was in an emergency room with a broken arm and a 6-week-old baby. And you would not leave a dinner. And you told me to call an Uber. Because Vanessa's trip was already paid for. I know now who paid for it. I know all of it. The house that was never in danger. The pension that was never gutted. The account in Mom's name. The 9 years. I'm not going to argue any of it with you. Because there's nothing to argue. The money has stopped. It is not coming back. Vanessa is 37. She can get a job. You have $110,000 you thought I'd never know about. Start there. And I am not angry. That's the part I don't think you'll be able to stand. I'm just done. Drive home. And Vanessa, who had not said a word, said the only thing she said, which was, "You can't do this to us. You don't understand how expensive my life is." And I looked at my sister, tanned and certain and genuinely bewildered that the faucet had opinions. And I understood that she had never once in her life had to understand how expensive anyone else's life was. And I said, "I do understand. I paid for it for 9 years. Goodbye, Vanessa." And I closed the door, not slammed. Just closed. Gently. Completely. In the way you close out a structure that has finally been certified to stand on its own, and on the other side of it, I listened to the three of them stand in silence. Because silence was the one load they had never built anything to carry. And then I heard them go down the steps. And I heard the car. And then nothing. And the nothing was the soundest thing I had ever heard. Here is how it all came to rest. Without my $4,500 a month, the household my parents had built on my back found its true shape fast. Vanessa, 37, with no job and no rent money and a sister who no longer answered the phone, was evicted from the apartment she had told everyone she earned. And she moved back into my parents' paid-off house, into her childhood bedroom. And the last I heard, she had taken a part-time job at a boutique. The first real job of her adult life. My parents dipped into the $110,000 they had skimmed and hidden, the secret cushion built out of my labor, and discovered that a cushion drains quickly when it is the only thing holding up two adults who have forgotten how to carry themselves. And the story they tried to tell the relatives that I was the cold, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her struggling parents did not survive. Because my grandfather, the man they had spent 3 years painting as confused, sat down at a family gathering with that worn brown folder and let a few of the aunts and uncles read the real ledger for themselves. And a man with 30 years of federal bookkeeping and a folder full of quarterly statements is very difficult to call confused. And one by one the relatives did the subtraction. And the version of the story in which I was the villain quietly died, for lack of anyone left to believe it. My grandfather did one more thing. He sold his house, the modest house in the valuable neighborhood, and he did not move in with my parents, who had developed, the moment the will became known through the family grapevine, a sudden and tearful concern for his comfort and a flurry of invitations to Sunday dinners he had not been welcome at in 3 years. He declined all of them. He bought a small place 8 minutes from mine, so that he could be near. In his words, the two people in this family worth the drive. And every Sunday he comes for dinner. And he holds Theo, who is 2 now, and calls him Pop Pop and has date. Everyone agrees. The old man's steady, patient way of looking at a thing before he reaches for it. He keeps a copy of the will in his new house and the original with Monsieur Delacroix. And he keeps the worn brown folder of quarterly statements too. Not out of spite, but out of habit. Because a bookkeeper does not throw away a reconciled account. And because, he says, a person should always be able to put their hand on the truth if anyone ever tries to tell them they imagined it. The sealed letters went to my father and to Vanessa, delivered by Ms. Delacroix, as instructed. I do not know what they said. I have thought about them many times, the plain words a careful old man wrote down for the son who pushed him out and the granddaughter who fed on her sister. The difference, in his handwriting, between being given and being worth, and I have decided that whatever those letters said, they were the truest thing my grandfather ever left to either of them, and the only inheritance that might, on some far day, actually make them larger than they were. And once, a few months ago, when Theo was asleep and the dishes were done, I asked my grandfather if he ever felt any regret about leaving his own son $1. And he looked at me over his reading glasses. The same look he must have given 1,000 columns of figures that did not add up. And he said, "Reagan, I spent 30 years certifying ledgers. And the one rule The only rule that ever mattered was that the books have to tell the truth. Even when the truth is hard. Even when it's family. Especially when it's family. I am not punishing my son. I am just refusing. With the last document I will ever sign. To certify a lie. He'll get the $1. And he'll get the letter. And the letter tells him exactly why. In plain words. The way I'd have wanted somebody to tell me. What he does with it is his ledger now. Not mine. Audit me anytime. Sweetheart. My books are clean. So that is my story. Coincidental. A broken arm. A 6-week-old baby. An Uber I was told to call. And 9 years and $486,000 sent to hold up a house that was never falling, and a quiet old man who kept the real books in a folder in his truck. Waiting. For 2 years. For the night I would finally be ready to read them. If you are the strong one, the dependable one, the load-bearing wall, in a family full of people who enjoy the shelter and never once thank the wall, hear the one thing it took a broken arm to teach me. The people who only call you when the transfer is late were never holding you up, you were holding them up. And they called your strength a fact about you, so they would never have to call it a gift. A fact. You see, does not have to be thanked. A fact does not get to be tired. A fact does not get to say no. That is why they worked so hard. For so many years. To convince me that my carrying them was simply my nature and not my choice, because the moment it became a choice, it became something I could stop choosing. You are allowed to set the weight down. You are allowed to stop signing the checks. You do not owe an explanation to people who saw your devotion and filed it under income. And somewhere in your life there may be one quiet person who kept the real ledger all along. Find them. Thank them. Show up for them in the rain. Because they are the whole family you ever actually had. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And tell me about the quiet bookkeeper in the corner of your family. The one who saw the truth when everyone else was busy spending it. Because I read every single one. From a townhouse in Portland. With a folder of quarterly statements in a fireproof box, and a 2-year-old upstairs who looks at the world the way his great-grandfather does. With an old army accountant coming for dinner every Sunday, and a peace that feels, after all these years, like ere I am Reagan Hale. I was the strong one, and the strongest thing I ever did was stop carrying them. Hold my son, and let the quiet man who kept the books, finally, after 60 patient years, balance the last one in my favor. A cruise ship does not leave port because the ocean feels sorry for it. It leaves because someone paid the fare. Checked the manifest, stocked the cabins, and cleared the route. For 9 years, my family had treated my money like open water, something endless. Moving beneath them. Carrying Vanessa from one comfortable shore to the next without anyone asking where the current began. But every voyage has a record. Every ticket has a payer. Every bright photograph taken under vacation lights has a shadow ledger somewhere behind it. That was the lesson I wanted Theo to inherit. Not the bitterness of it, but the clarity. Generosity should never require blindness. Helping family should never mean becoming the hidden engine under someone else's luxury. If a need is real, it can survive questions. If love is honest, it can survive a boundary. And if people only call you cruel when the money stops, then they were not loving your presence, they were depending on your silence. From that day forward, I would teach my son that kindness is strongest when it knows where the dock ends, where the rope is tied, and when it is time to pull the anchor home. Scriptwriter Nguyen Van Chien.